the panelists first. We will discuss some questions that I will ask, but later I will ask the audience to join in for comments or questions. So let's start with Birgitta. She's from Sweden, and she's a member of parliament in Sweden, belonging to the Liberals, party that used to be the Swedish Folkpartiet. She has been a minister before. She was a minister for European affairs, European Union, during the previous Swedish government. But she's also a very well-known feminist debateur. So she was one of the persons, when I saw on the guest list, I was like, yes, I want to do this. I want to be the moderator.
We found her.
Then next is Daniel Kjær, who is an Estonian diplomat and an ambassador to many countries, to Serbia, Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Did I miss? Montenegro. But what is maybe most interesting is that Daniel has worked a lot in developing countries, among others Rwanda, which is of particular interest because it has had the highest share of women in parliament for, I think, quite some years by now. And he has also worked in Afghanistan. And next we have Eva Biaudet, who is also a person I was like, yes. Because she has been ombudsman in Finland for minority issues and discrimination. Is that right?
Yeah, because later was a non-discrimination ombudsman.
Okay.
The same position.
Yes, and she's well from Finland, but she is Swedish-Finnish, I guess, from your name and from your party, because you belong to the Swedish People's Party in Finland. And now she's a member of parliament in Finland. But she has also been a minister.
17 years.
For 17 years, okay. But she has also been a minister, so she has been a minister for gender equality and social affairs, right? And then Alexandra Rosén, I guess I already introduced you, unless you want to add something, but no. Just starting from what Alexandra spoke about the challenges that women in politics face, and maybe I would start, Birgitta, with you over there. I was specifically interested in the women politicians in this panel. That what has your what is your experience with the biggest challenges, or what has been most challenging for you as a women politician during your career?
Thank you so much. It's a great opportunity for me to be here, and I think we actually should use more time in politics generally to discuss this issue, because it's still a burning issue in many Western countries of today, and also in many European countries. For me, I've been active into politics since 1994, and on national level since 1999, when I was 24 years old, and I was elected as the president of the Liberal Youth of Sweden. That's the kind of youth wing of my party, the Liberal Party. And I think that especially the Nordic countries are quite unique in this aspect, because the youth fractions of the party are very strong, and you can see that they kind of educate young leaders to be ministers further on, or to take parts in parliament. And I think also that's one of the reasons that we have quite a few women in parliament, actually, because both among young men and young women, you can see that this is one opportunity for them. I'm writing a book actually right now that I will launch in January about my challenges in politics for the years Bonnier book company. So I will explore more about my challenges in that book. But for me, I think what was very strange from a Swedish perspective was when I was actually before I was appointed as the minister back in 2010, because I think most of you have the image of my country, and I have that myself, that we're one of the most gender equal countries in the world. It's a very modern country. It's a very, it's a country with very secular views and very modern minded in so many aspects. And just like even before I was asked to be the minister, I did something that is not very normal in Sweden. I said, I think I should be the next Minister for European Affairs. I should be the one that should have this position, because I was one of the Cecilia Malmström that had that position. She was appointed to become the commissioner in the European Union, and I had then been in Parliament for 8 years and in the Committee on Foreign Affairs. So I did something that is very odd also in my countries for women, to say that, well, I'm here, I want power, and I think I'm the right person to have this. And the newspapers, they did all these opinion polls in my party, and I got like 80% all the time that people wanted me in my party to have this position. Not the leadership perhaps, but the people, the party people wanted me to have this position. But then I could read like, before they were having this official nomination and everything, and even before they asked me, I could read on Dagens Nyheter Daily News, the huge morning paper in Sweden, I could read one day that Birgitta Ohlsson, she cannot be the new Minister for European Affairs because she's pregnant. I was pregnant. I was going to deliver my first daughter later that year during the summer. I had actually only told my parents, and of course my husband knew it, and my close friends and my close co-workers. And they kind of outed my pregnancy, the biggest newspaper, and they said, I cannot be the new minister because I'm pregnant. I think that caused a rage in Sweden that we should have such a debate in the year 2010. I wasn't the first woman that was going to have a very tough position in politics and also be a mother. I mean, we've had that discussion so many times, but that was such a strange debate, and so many parliamentarians, especially from the Conservative Party, they engaged in this debate, and they said that my wife, she would never accept such a position, if blah blah blah, and that actually showed that also a country that is so modern from the outside view still has major challenges. And I delivered my first daughter when I was the minister, and I delivered my second daughter when I was the minister, and then we had no debate at all. So I think it was very important for me. I hate to do this as a female politician all the time. Journalists are asking you, how can you survive? How can you manage all this? How can you manage to be a mother? How can you fix everything and still have a power position and travel so much as you do? And I had in this government so many men that actually became parents during the same time, and they never got this question at all. And I think that was very sad. So I actually turned that into a mission myself, that I actually explained all the time that it's possible to have a power position and it's possible to be a mother at the same time. So that was kind of my mission to kind of, and I think that also actually, I spoke at a feminist network the other night, and so many young people at the seminar told me that I had kind of paved the way for them, that they didn't take no for an answer. They kind of took all the positions that they were asked, and they asked themselves to become the leaders too. So I think that's also very important to have this. And I said like this, that I can fix this because I'm married to a modern man, not a dinosaur. So that was also a quote from me, that you need to have someone that is supporting you. And actually quite a few women have that today. So that was my major kind of feminist debate personally in this aspect.
Okay, yeah, actually I remember that. I followed the news closely.
The story came abroad, actually.
No, I was reading the same Dagens Nyheter at that time. So. Eva, I will jump right to you, because you have the same sort of category with a very long political career behind you. So do you have any example of a particularly big challenge you have faced?
Thank you. Actually, it struck me when Birgitta spoke that I think that for a woman it was an advantage to be young when coming into politics. I was also 27 when I was elected into the Helsinki City Council, and I was 30 when I was first elected into Parliament. And in my first term in Parliament, I got 3 children. And then my fourth actually came just when I had become minister, or I got pregnant, and then, you know, a lot happened, but still. But when I think about, you know, back, I think one of the biggest sort of revelations for me was that I very much lived the myth of equality, of gender equality when I was young, and as a young politician, it wasn't really apparent for me that we still had these gender issues, because that's how the rhetorics, it's a little bit the same with, of course, discrimination in general. We have a lot of rhetorics that actually is not, is somehow making an obstacle for many people to see, to make it visible that it actually really exists. So there was a lot of sort of illusion that collapsed, in particular when you had this position. And actually I now remember I had a very supportive husband. We Nevertheless, we divorced in my second term. It is, and I think the divorce rate is actually quite high among female politicians. It's not an easy combination, I think, for anyone. But I remember now that I actually promised that I would never become a party leader at some point, very young. That, you know, I may go high at home. I don't think my husband actually ever requested this, but somehow, because of the stereotype that I could go far, but not really to the top, you know, that you should do almost everything. And of course I was hungry, and I you know, very much wanted to have both family and career and to be in the top of politics. But I think this was one of the things somehow, and I realized that I had to struggle also with many myths. You know, I was very sort of, and I think this I find again and again among women in particular, that we still believe that, you know, it is the argument that wins. It's not the networking that gives you influence. And we don't have access. We realize we don't have access to the same networks. And so we, you know, we work like crazy and do a lot of, you know, read, and we are very competent, and we somehow believe that this will keep us, you know, this will somehow pave the way, and it actually doesn't. And I think that at some point you notice that you need to network and you need to support each other no matter what for it to happen. So I think that quite early we started to notice it and started to be more conscious on our gender in politics, but I wasn't in the beginning. Nevertheless, I think that when you were young, you were allowed to be angry young woman. When you got a little bit older, the angry part wasn't so nice anymore, and actually you became uncomfortable and not so sympathetic. And when it was about electing you to something, to a leadership post, you know, the person is very competent, but she's a little bit difficult, you know, or, you know, she's from this radical niche and she actually is not sort of a general leader, or these kind of arguments you face that I think are very connected to your gender and the stereotyping that we talked about on what is expected. And I think also when in the beginning Kate Pentus-Rosimannus took up the Sheryl Sandberg book and about your Harvard students, I think that the most interesting part in that book was the part when they were asked, the students, about the competences of Mary and John or whoever they were, the two stories about, the similar stories about the careers. And in the end, they were sort of equal in sort of curricula, you know, in CVs. But then in the end, when they were asked, with whom would you like to work with? It was obvious that the woman was not as a nice person to work with as the man. And I think this is the stereotypes, you know, I see, you know, when I am in television and I'm interviewed and I have sometimes decide to take, you know, really a lot of space and not be sort of, you know, a nice girl, I get much more hate mail when I don't. And I'm sure this is one of the things what also probably you do. Yeah. So I think the stereotyping roles is difficult, and that it took actually a long time for me to realize that I had this obstacle, because I wasn't really aware about it when I was younger.
So how long did it take? I mean, is it like what, 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I think it came quite quickly when you, of course, had your children. But I do think that there was a lot happening, because when I was elected in 1991 into Parliament, we had the feeling that it was a gender election. I don't know, my phone or something. It was a gender election, and there was a lot of women's issues. In the 1990s, there was sort of this idea that everything, you know, develops. We had human rights were very strong. We had Beijing. We have a lot of things. So somehow a lot happened at the same time. And for instance, we had the first women speaker in the Finnish Parliament, and we changed our order of the day. So that actually, when I had my first children, I really had to carry 3 small children to the evenings and vote, and I got reprimands because they stood around, at the doors of the plenary with their noses looking at mommy when she went in. But soon after that, actually, the speaker changed the order of the day so that we wouldn't have votes anymore in the evenings. And we would be able to plan so that I knew that, tonight I can go home at 6 o'clock, and tomorrow I will stay late and do something. And that actually made a big, big difference for us mothers. Obviously, it didn't change so much for the fathers, but perhaps today, eventually, it also has changed, of course, for everybody, a much more sort of human and family-friendly environment.
Okay, Daniel, you don't have personal experience, but thinking about your experience from the countries where you have worked, I mean the developing countries, because this is part of a development cooperation project. What would you say are the greatest obstacles for women? I mean, if you think about working in Rwanda or working in Afghanistan.
Yes, thank you very much, and also thanks to the organizers, and thank you for inviting me. I think it's a great honor to be in such a panel, and I'm very happy to be here. From the Rwandan aspect, I mean, I think you all know that there's a quota system in place in the parliament, which has helped them tremendously throughout government and local government. There's a 30% quota for women. I think it's 64% of women. Members of parliament are female in Rwanda. And of course, Rwanda has its history of the link to the genocide, where the gender balance in terms of numbers was greatly skewed, with women mothers having to take upon themselves the responsibility for not only for rebuilding the country, but also for looking after the families and the children. For example, one of my staff that I had in Rwanda not only had her own 3-4 children, but also the children of her sister, and also adopted some other kids from her family whose parents were killed in the genocide. So I mean, it really gives a really big responsibility onto the females in Rwanda. As to the obstacles, I mean, I'll focus just on the Rwandan example for right now. At the top level, there's an understanding, a very sort of enlightened understanding of all of these gender questions, and for example, they pushed through the legalization of abortion. Rwanda is a very conservative country, and the people were against this, but the leadership pushed it through for 4 reasons: for incest, rape, if there's a health threat to the mother or to the child. So I mean, they're very enlightened in these questions, but the problem is that the basic understanding of these concepts throughout the country is not in line with what the understanding is in the capital or in the leadership. It's sort of, I think, a lot has been talked about these stereotypes, and I think the stereotype aspect is where women have the most difficult time, the most challenges. And I think the same points that you both brought up today, I mean, still apply in Rwanda. There's just a positive that in addition to the 30% that has to be there was another 30% that was voted by competing with their male colleagues, or they're competing against their male other politicians. So I mean, I think the key is that is in Rwanda, for example, they have Umuganda, which takes place once a month, which is a common cleaning and sort of taking care of your environment project. And after that, they always have sort of like a village meeting or something like that, where they often pass on these messages. So it's really the education and informing often the males, but also the females of that it's okay for you to have similar roles, that doesn't have to be man's role and a woman's role. So I mean, I think really this educational aspect and starting at the grassroots level is something that Rwanda has very much focused on. And I think the fact that again that females are being elected to the parliament outside of the quota is an example that people are understanding that there is I think that there is this equality in gender. I think the next step in Rwanda is ensuring that these people that are elected or that are placed into these high positions also are able to influence the process. And I think even in some of these questions, us in Europe also have to still continue tackling. Thank you.
Can I just, as a follow-up question, do you think that, I mean, eventually the quotas in Rwanda can be taken away? If you say 64% of the parliamentarians are already women, that's a really high proportion.
As I said, I think since there's a 30% requirement, then for women's seats, it's an indirect election. Those 30%. So I mean, it's but the rest of the top up is direct election. So I mean, there's still, you know, it's not. I mean, I can't see it. I don't see, or there was no indication that this was sort of a pushed or sort of, you know, government pushed thing. It was actually the people who were voting for these people because they represent them the best. And I mean, it might also be the case that a lot of the men from the region have moved more to center. So when you have the village level, it's still the women who are doing the farming and looking after the areas. So they're maybe better known in those areas. But I think that eventually, yeah, they will be able to take those quotas away. But as I said again, the important question is what is the influence? I mean, Rwanda is a presidential system, so I mean it's a strong president. So I mean, at the end of the day, it's also, as I said, I think we have the same question in Europe. Is yes, we have, the numbers are showing, but are they actually, you know, are we able to influence? Are we still participating in, you know, are women still participating fully in the process?
So maybe this is a question to all of you, or maybe you can start. When does the policy start to change? I mean, how many women does it take? How many should be in the parliament?
That's a difficult question.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's an interesting one as well, because when you look at the, I mean, following up to what Daniel said about the actual influence, and looking a little bit beyond the numbers, because we're very much looking at the numbers, and we are at, okay, 20%, and we're moving to 25%. But what kind of positions and what influence of power do those women who are in parliament have, and how to measure that and how to work with that is something that we are trying to look at and trying to grasp. Also, I'm very happy to see that the European Institute for Gender Equality, they're actually developing a gender assessment tool for parliaments in Europe, that parliaments can use in order to see how they're working and what kind of positions women in parliaments have. But when the policies will change.
Eva would like to answer that. I'm going to get that after that.
I think this is a very interesting issue, because we don't have quotas for the parliamentary mandates, but of course we have a pressure on the parties that we would actually set up equal amount of candidates of both women and men, and of course try to look at that it would be balanced in many other ways too, which of course is not always so successful, and it's not always as successful. We still see that on the municipalities, actually the gender equality, somehow there's a much lower success rate. I mean, we have more than 40% women in the parliament, but we have actually in some municipalities, and like in the big cities, actually they can even be majority women, but in the sort of more rural areas, it is actually a challenge. And if you look at the municipal mayors, for instance, it's actually very bad also in Finland. I think it is important to count. I think I'm so inspired by the Swedish, what is it called? I don't remember what it's on the web, when they actually are counting women on all places, because I think that gives you advice, and it opens the perspective to see that if it's not even, then why is it not even? And there can, of course, be different reasons. And I am not saying that it always have to be sort of mathematically absolutely even. But there is a problem that we have not managed to have more than 42% women in parliament ever for the last 25 years. I mean, we got to this level, but why has it stuck? There's a problem why we can't be even. And I think if we would be sort of sometimes 40 and sometimes 55 and sometimes 49, you know, that it would actually sort of mix, then it would be a nice, this 40-60 thinking about what would be sort of even would be fine. But because it's always sort of minority women and majority men, I think it's a problem. And I think it's a problem also that one can see that there's sort of backlashes when we have got more than 40% women, when there is influence and they change or try to change the agenda. It is felt like a threat, and there's sort of a backlash where there is a feeling that, you know, they are protecting the normal status quo and fighting back, like as if we would be majority, as if we would take over. I mean, it's very ordinary that you hear that now women are taking over, and we are not at 50 even. I don't know what kind of mathematics is that, but this is how it is, of course. I think that, you know, when we are disturbing the normal order, well, that's actually a sign of having some influence. And so there is an influence, but of course it's not even. And we have, in the Finnish parliament, you can see that we don't have, there's very segregated roles in parliament, I think more than in a long time, that in the economic issues it's sort of male-dominated, in social and health and education it's women. We know from research that when we listen to experts in the committee work, preparing legislation, the majority are men who are called in as experts. And there's very little analysis on what does it do, you know, what kind of legislation comes out of this. In spite, you know, and then of course it makes a difference. I mean, it's also important that the preparatory work is sort of, there's a gender aspect to it. So it's not enough to have the decision makers, we need to sort of go through the whole thing. And I believe in counting. Quotas can correct when it's impossible to change the numbers, but I think that we should start counting and make it visible that it's not even.
Okay, Birgitta, you also wanted to comment.
I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not only about numbers. You need to have a broader strategy. And for example, when the government that I was part of, we were actually more women than men during these years, but still men had the most powerful positions in that government. I mean, we had Carl Bildt, he was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and we had like Minister for Finance was a man, the Prime Minister, and so on. So I think that's also important to get this structure inside. And also to see that the European and the Nordic and the Baltic history when it comes to the power of women in parliament is a kind of a late story. I mean, we were really late bloomers. In Sweden, women got the right to vote back in 1921. And when I was born in the mid-1970s, we were still only 20% women in the parliament. So it was actually in the 1990s that we got more than 40% in the Swedish parliament, and we're now around like 45%. And even though most Swedish parties introduced like 20 or 25 years ago the mixed list where you have one woman, one man, and you're following this structure, and my party, we were the ones actually launching this together with the Social Democrats in the beginning of the 1990s. I mean, in the last elections, my party were actually the second worst party in the parliament when it comes to women. We were only 30%. Then some men kind of left, and now we're 45 or something, so it's another story. But still, so it's a very fragile system, even if you have political parties that are very aware about the situation. And I think connecting to Daniel, what we said when we were discussing other countries, I think Rwanda is very special because, I mean, you have 64% women among the parliamentarians, but it's still one man having all the power. So it's also another story. But we should also see that it wasn't European countries that were the first in the world to elect women to lead the country. I mean, countries like Sri Lanka, India, and Israel, they were 20 years before Margaret Thatcher, when she was the first European woman to be elected to lead the government and to lead the country. So it's important to have this story with us. I think what Eva said. I think we should discuss more about the role of glass ceilings. I mean, everyone knows this very famous speech, "Tear this wall down," that was launched in Berlin. With Reagan, but we should have, I think, another feminist story, tear that glass ceiling down. And I think what will happen in the United States, hopefully in 3 weeks, with Hillary Clinton as the first woman as the president in the United States, will actually pave the way for so many other women in the world, because the symbols are so important. We've never had a woman as prime minister in my country. I mean, that's shameful. We were the last country in the Nordic countries to give the right to vote to women, and we will be the last one to have a woman as a leader. And I think that shows something. And also in the very gender equal countries, men and many women still have problems with women on top positions. They still have that. I mean, Sweden, we're great when it comes to a broad feminist perspective, to have women and men almost 50-50 on many levels when it comes to state-run boards or so on. I mean, we have a good, and we have also on local level when it comes to politicians, it's almost 50-50 in many local municipalities. But when you reach the highest position, it's still, I mean, it's still very bad statistics. I think this should be discussed more. And what does it say about our societies?
Yeah, about just one comment about maybe having a female president in the United States soon. When Estonia got its first woman president, really my feeling was that I have a daughter who is 14, and I was like, wow, she will have a woman president between 14 and 19. I mean, that is great. Mm-hmm. She will probably grow up thinking that it's possible. So it is inspiring. But Daniel first, and then...
Can I just say a little bit to this? But you need to be aware how she will be treated. I think because that's what we learn, that it's really tough for women in that position. Look at our prime ministers and our presidents, how they were treated. So beware and support.
No, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I think it's, I mean, I even wrote down here is, you were talking about the norm. I mean, we have to change the norm. And I think I saw a video, I think it was at a UK school, where they went to young students and they asked them to draw a picture of a fighter pilot, a surgeon, a firefighter, and a race car driver. And out of the 30 or whatever kids, something like 3 or 4 drew women and the rest drew men. And then they brought one of each into the classroom. Of course, a fighter pilot with a helmet, the surgeon with, the face covered, a mask, and the firefighter and so forth. And they took off their masks, and they were all women. And I think we need more of that messaging at the grassroots level. Because, I mean, if that doesn't happen, then these norms are going to stay. I mean, if they don't start at the basic level, things are not going to change. I mean, if you're already at the top and you already have this norm, I mean, the chances of changing that are close to zero. But if we don't start at the bottom, then we're not going to change these stereotypes.
I think it has to do with redefining the notion of leadership, and what is leadership, and how do you define different types of leadership, and why is it important? And I think that. I mean, today we think about you have to be confrontational, you have to have all these specific characteristics to be seen as a strong leader. But I think it's important to bring in other characteristics as well. And I'm not saying that women would bring that in, but I'm saying that there should be different types of how we see leadership as well.
I will pick up on what Eva told about how your president was treated while she was a president. I work for a feminist blog, with 3 amazing women. And when we had this, the presidential campaign here in Estonia, we followed it, of course. And during the campaign in Estonia was a bit strange because people sort of became candidates without being officially candidates. So this way the numbers from my example won't really match with the final numbers. But we emailed 2 of the women candidates and 5 of the men who said that they were candidates and asked them if they have received any sort of specific question just because of the gender from media. How has media been treating them? And we got the responses from 3 men saying that never. Actually, one of them even specified that I think I've only received questions related to my work, like ever. One of the women politely declined, saying that there has been too much of this. She doesn't want to, go all over it again. And the other sent us a list of questions. I will quote. This is like a top list of the questions she got. Question number 1. How do you feel in the mornings when you go to work and know that your children will stay behind? Question number 2. Do you feel that the presidential campaign takes away time from your children? Question number 3. Why don't you have exactly the average number of children? The average in the country. Question number 4. Which jewelry do you like to wear and how expensive is it? Question number 5. What is your favorite face cream or perfume or underwear? Question number 6. How much did your outfit cost at that reception? Question number 7. What is the brand of your handbag and how much did it cost? And question number 8. Is your scarf an original and how much did it cost? So it's a lot about family, but it's a lot of consumer issues. Skin creams and handbags and, underwear, actually. What is your reaction when you hear this?
I think it's very common, and we had such an incident actually in Sweden a couple of years ago when Mona Sahlin was competing to become the prime minister in Sweden when she was leading the Social Democratic Party. And actually, Margot Wallström, who is now the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Sweden, she had actually given Mona Sahlin one handbag that was costing, I'm not sure, but like 5,000 Swedish kronor or something. And this caused a big debate at the woman leading a Social Democratic Party having such an expensive, fancy bag. And she was very proud of that bag. So she did in the back. She kind of had it. It was very super red, the color, and she was having it in front of her all the time. And it was so interesting because then some journalists at the evening papers and others, that had a kind of a feminist approach, they started to ask about the men's, what they were wearing. And someone was finding out that our Prime Minister, Fredrik Reinfeldt, he had a bag that costed, I'm not sure how many, but it was totally super expensive. So that story kind of twisted after a while. But it was so controversial all the time. And I think Sheryl Sandberg, you mentioned her before in the debate, I think she has said something very wise once, that we need to have more portraits in the media of happy career mothers. that you can actually have a great life, and you can have a career and you can have a family at the same time. And I think that's so important to show, especially young women. I try to have this as a mission myself, to go out and say, hey, it can be kind of tough to combine all these things, because I go to the kindergarten, and we have actually a kindergarten at the Swedish Parliament. So if you have late vote, you can actually have your kids, and that's a great privilege. I think we were the first parliament in the world to launch that, and now we have, I think it's like 20 parliaments in the world that started this initiative. So I think it's important to show that you can do both, but we need to change the image of a mother with power and a career to also have a great life, because that's what they're kind of all the time exploiting, that you will be very miserable if you have all this, you will have a very unhappy life and da. So I think it's important to twist the image.
But what should you do as a young women politician? Should you reply to questions like this, or should you just
I have to admit that I'm a bit two-folded on how to interact. I think, I mean, most of this I mean, it's super silly. You should just avoid it. I mean, I think if someone is asking me such questions, I always say, do you ask Carl Bildt the same questions? And then they tend to be quiet, actually, most of them. You can twist it yourself. But on the other hand, sometimes I think it's so important that especially feminist politicians like myself, that we go into the media where you can meet the young girls. When magazines for teenage girls, if they ask me, could I interview you on career or whatsoever, or what about your education, I always say yes, you can. And when Swedish papers with focus on parenting, if they ask me, I think that's the greatest arena for me to talk about, that we should actually split the parental leave between 50-50 between men and women in Sweden. So I try to use this area sometimes, even though I need to a bit talk about myself and about my family and about my relation, blah blah blah, and everything that I do not want to talk about. I try to use that to take my feminist policies into this area, because then I reach the women that I want to reach. So.
Eva, you wanted to comment?
I actually agree, and I think that the difference between men and women are that we are actually, our private is always felt as public, and that's of course is confusing, because there are different, you know, because we also say that, you know, that part of the feminist agenda is the private becoming, you know, political, and of course where do you draw the line? And I think I also try to see that, and men have through the, you know, history been able to be really behaving badly in their private life and yet be extraordinary men. They can have been alcoholics, I mean, unfaithful, having loads of children everywhere, I mean, and do whatever. And still we have been able to say that, well, we admire them as in their profession. But a woman, it hasn't been so easy to separate. I mean, you have been treated as a whole. And in a way, I think that's more healthy. I mean, I think men also should be judged on how they live and how they do, not only how they preach and how they work. So in that sense, I somehow try also to bring the issue that I think that we should try to start asking also the male politicians about gender policies, about how they combine family and work, and how they see that how the working life is actually family friendly at all. And because what we would like to do is actually, how you said it, that we would like to change working life and to change political life, not so be so old-fashioned male. And actually we would do a favor for everyone in the future where we could be more equal. So I'm not so protective either on my privacy, and I've been trying also to change this into politics, and also have found that those channels where I can reach media, sometimes through being very personal, is actually a very good channel in talking to people about things I think are important. But I think we should be stronger, because I know that in the last, for instance, parliamentary election, where we had, I think, only one party leader who was a woman. It was terrible. I think I was sort of dying when I saw these television, panels. I really felt that there's really no one for me. Even if my own party leader was there, I felt that, oh. And not one journalist asked them anything about gender or gender policies. They didn't have to answer this question. They were sort of left. If there would have been more women, they would probably have asked. And I know when I ran as presidential candidate last time, we were 2 women, and I was trying to bring up the issue that one of the candidates actually was abortion negative. He was against girls to have sexual rights, and health, sexual health, and so forth. And I think that in Finland, the president is leading sort of the international policy in the UN. So I think that was actually very relevant. And they were sort of dismissing this issue as, well, let's talk about the euro, And I was like, oh, the president doesn't decide on the euro. He decides in the UN, or something. So I think we have a challenge there to bring also our agenda, that the men had to be accountable on why isn't there gender equality? Why aren't these issues? How do you lack experience in your leadership when you you don't know about how families live, or, I mean, because that's actually a very big gap in their competence if they have been able to live this sort of secluded professional life. And it's not only about having children, so also the whole social, I mean, because we're not only taking care of our children, we also care for sisters or cousins or parents or something like that. So it's not only about mothers or motherhood.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I agree with, you know, we need more champions, and we need more people to look up to, and I think that we need more men to look up to. Who I mean, as you said, there's no stories about, you know, the parliamentarians who take their kids to nursery school before they come to work, or you know, or
there was my chair, Mr. Lipponen, who was prime minister when I was minister. He got an equality prize because he had taken 2 weeks family leave. I was a lone mother of 4. No, but I felt a little bit.
Still, some of us do it regularly, but I mean, these stories, I mean, they're not interested. I mean, the media
No.
should do more about it. But I mean, but back to your question, what if a male presidential candidate would have brought up sexual rights in the debate? What would have been the results for? Would that have been a positive for that presidential candidate, a male, or would that have been a negative? I mean, is there also the two standards there?
That's an excellent pitch for our next panel that will discuss who should speak on behalf of women. And just as a follow-up on what Birgitta mentioned, we actually had in mind to ask all these questions, to send them to the male candidates, just for fun and to see see what they will say. But then the presidential campaign got a bit weird, so in the end we didn't do it. But I will keep them in my archives, and I think they will come in handy at some day. Now, the audience, if you have any questions or comments, you are very welcome. And we need help with the microphones, because I think we need them, right, for the TV? So one here and one. Okay. Yeah. Well, we can maybe start here and then. And
Hi.
please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Hannah. I'm going to be in the next panel. I'm from a legal aid office in Norway working with women's rights. And I just have a question to Eva and Birgitta. We have been talking quite a lot about hate speech lately in Norway. And I just would like to know, how are you affected by this? Why do you think hate speech is often very bad for women, or it's very bad towards women? And what can be done?
Okay, thank you. Can take your comment, the ladies over there, right away.
Cornelia Godfrey from the Austrian Embassy. Coming from my own experience, there's two things, or a few things I think make women successful and wanting to go in the leadership position. A, the right background in the schooling. So what Daniel said is very, very relevant, that in school they learn they are equal. A mother who will be supporting them and will be a role model and will say, you can do everything. But to really get women into leadership positions, we have to ask us, what can we do to attract them? That's in politics and in positions. Because a lot of them turn away from it because it's not attractive to them. So if we want more women in politics, what can we do to make the job as a politician be more attractive as a woman?
Question about hate speech. Who would like to start?
I think both have had our share. I think you are affected, and that actually surprises oneself, that it affects you, and that it's really, and of course at some point I have decided not to read a big part of it. That is really bad. There are different degrees, of course, and then you find strategies when you answer in a clever way or something like that. but it does affect you, and I think it's insulting, and I in particular feel that it has really shocked me that in my country, once again, this myth about what I thought about my country, that, you know, this violence against women, which of course the numbers are high in Finland anyway, but this verbal, how much there is verbal violence, sexual violence against women, and usually it's connected to racism, I mean, all kind of discrimination. But when you are a woman, you always also get the, you know, misogynist hate speech. It's always connected, which the men don't get in the same way. They also get, of course, racist hate speech, but it's not about raping you, or we wish that you would be raped, or your children, or your daughters, or this kind. And that actually has shocked me, because it's difficult to imagine that there isn't a connection to this verbal and, you know, what people actually would sometimes be able to do. Of course, I do understand that there is a difference, but still, it is, and the idea that, you know, do they think, is this what they actually think about, you know, how you punish a woman, you know, in particular? That has surprised me a lot, and it does affect me, and perhaps this sort of disappointment on that, you know, what is wrong with our sort of famous education when actually it has brought us to this, hasn't brought us further. The second, I think I agree with the success, but I do think we need to be more, sort of make visible the stereotyping in politics, you know, the model, how we actually behave. We need to change that. I don't think people don't find it attractive to be treated badly or you know, judged upon your appearances, or even if you are a, you know, extraordinary leader person. I think there are not so many people who, you shouldn't need to be extremely brave or extrovert or a little bit narcissist to be a politician. It would be nice if also other kinds of people would like to be politicians.
I think at the same time you need to have a bit of that, actually, to survive in politics and to get engaged. And I think that's also very provoking if women actually see themselves as very strong and so on. And but what is also very sad, and what is touching upon both the questions that you're raising, is that I think that quite a few women, especially young women, when they see the hate speech in the media and in the social media especially, and when they see how women are treated, they tend to think that this is not a very beautiful world. This is not what I want to be part of. And I've been kind of in a political turmoil during the last 5 or 6 weeks because two people in my party came out in the media, and as actually 2 women came out in the media. It came from other parts in the party, so it was a very well structured thing. But they went out in the media and said that they wanted me to leave the leadership of the party. I'm part of the leadership, and I'm the most voted. I'm the most voted candidate in my party, in parliament, and in my group. I got more votes than the party leader. We're in the same constituency, and I have a very strong position in my party. And that's why I'm, of course, very threatening to very many people in my party. So they wanted me to leave, and they went out in the media. But what they didn't expect was that thousands of Swedish people actually came out and supported me. I mean, famous people from the media, authors. I was super amazed, actually, myself. And a lot of normal people, students at high schools, came out and they started this social media campaign for me. So they kind of flip-flopped the situation. So it ended up that I got even more support than before. So I think that was also very important, because quite a few young women especially, they mailed me and they said, when I see how you are being treated in the media, I really admire you. My mother is voting for you, I'm voting for you, all my family is voting for you, and we see how people are treating you. I don't want to go into politics ever. But then they could see that you could get a lot of love too. So I think that's important to show that it can be tough and it can be rough, but you can have a very strong position anyway, and to show good examples. I think in every country, when you look upon social media and female politicians, they are far too more, affected in a bad way. And what I can see through 25 years into politics is that when I started off, I got all these, letters, the paper letters, and people they were saying the same things, and they were very nasty, and sexual violence and everything. But now people tend to be more open. That's, I think, it's very. I can have like men that are very well established in the Swedish society that are sending me emails with their real name on and their address and everything, and tell me to shut up and I should leave politics, and I'm using all these bad words, sexual words on me. I mean, they're men with position in the society, and they tend to feel, I don't care, I just write my thing to her. And that didn't happen before. And I think also you can see on the other wave that you have the social media where you can be anonymous, you can write whatever you want to write. And if you're involved in the feminist issue, we live in a very polarized debate climate right now when it comes to migration in every country, and I'm one of the people in my parliament that really still believe that we should have much solidarity in these issues when it comes to helping people with so many refugees in the world. Then you are really target for those people. So it's kind of a combination, and I think we should discuss that more. We've started a huge debate in Sweden about this, and we were like 6 or 7 very famous female politicians that were out in a TV documentation like a year ago or something, and told about. We were reading the letters that we got from these male characters, and I feel people were shocked about what people. I mean, ordinary people didn't know about this, but I think it was important that we went out very blunt. And that actually, for me, some people, the hate situation actually went down a bit after that. So I think that some people might reflect on what they are doing.
We have done something similar, not as publicly and big as in Sweden, reading on television, but on Facebook we have shared, especially the feminists or anti-racists who have received these emails. And it's funny because in Estonia it's like 2 or 3 names. 2 or 3 people who are sending to everybody.
Yeah, they're very productive.
They're very, very productive, I must say. So it's at least we can sort of support each other. I'm afraid we have to wrap up this discussion. It has been really, really great. So I'm sorry, but we have another one coming up. So
very great.
I will maybe as a closing to close on a sort of positive note. Can you just shoot maybe one thing that people can do, politicians can do, or private persons to see more women in politics in the future? Should we start with you?
Yeah. Well, I think it has been mentioned before, but I would say continue to support women, support each other, and also invite men to the table and try to make men champions for this as well.
I also think that continue to support other women and create networks, also cross-party networks among women. The gender agenda is not always following party lines, and I think this is a way of achieving success.
I mean, I still believe in the grassroots level, and I'm just going to make sure that I tell my daughter that that the door is open for her, and whatever she wants to do, it's up to her, and hopefully encourage other fathers to do the same.
Sisterhood, of course, but also to create guerrilla movements with very, wise men, because you have them also, around. I had such a father, and I have such a husband, and you have them in the political parties. But also I think it's important to be feminist optimistic. I always say that my grandmother, Betty, she was born 1912, around 100 years ago, and she actually, she went to school like 3 semesters. 1.5 years, and she started to work as a child worker when she was 10 years old. And my mother was the first in our family then to study at university, and she was born in 1942. And that's a Swedish success story. And I think that we should be very feminist optimistic, because in many developing countries, women will jump, not like we've done in Europe. They will jump from one generation, like my grandmother, to my generation in one leap, and that's fantastic.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. And now we will switch panels. So you have like 5 minutes if you want to do something.